This is a movie all about interdomain routing and the history of interdomain routing over the past 20 years. The way we've done this is to actually take daily snapshots of the state of both BGP in terms of addresses and in terms of AS numbers, and paste these daily snapshots together to make a movie. Very quickly, to show you what's on the screen, the upper bar is IP, divided into 256/8 blocks. The lower bar is autonomous system numbers, and in the middle are two speedos that are trying to show you the rate of consumption. Yellow is the unallocated blocks of addresses and AS numbers that are still being held within IANA. When they get passed over to a regional internet registry, those blocks are marked in red, and when they actually get handed over to an end user or local internet registry, they're marked in green. The blue is reserved by the IETF. The early days through 83 to 86 were relatively quiet, as you can see. Small amount of consumption in the Class B space, around 128, very small amount of consumption in the C space, around 192, and some networks being added in the old A space. But by 1987, things were actually starting to change. This was at the time, if you might remember, when the National Science Foundation started up, and all of a sudden there were a whole set of universities and research institutions starting to join the internet. Most of that pressure was actually in the Class B space, and as you see, the expansion of those academic and research networks occurred around 128 through to about 140/8. You can see there the growth rate in Class Bs is quite high. Some As were being handed out as well. The C space was relatively quiet. It was pretty obvious though, even by 1990, as you can see, that phenomenal consumption of Class B networks was going to exhaust the Class B space very, very quickly. And by late 90 and early 91, we were able to predict that had we gone on like this, we'd actually run out of Class B networks by around 95. And you can see there why that the consumption rates on a daily basis are just rocketing up through, and we're already up to network 160. By 92, 93, the early commercialization was happening. Routing is actually still not growing that hard, so the routing numbers are quite low, the autonomous system numbers, but the amount of address space being deployed is actually now really quite high. You can see some of these /8s in the Class A space being handed out, and also heavily in the Bs. By 93 though, the IETF had come up with a solution to this consumption of the B problem, which was actually to move into classless interdomain routing. And if you look closely there around 198 and 200/8, the top of the Cs, you actually start to see some growth there. And that growth is actually CIDR-based allocations rather than Class Cs. And by late 94, early 95, as you can see, the consumption of the Class B space had virtually stopped, while most of the address space was actually being driven out of the top of the Class C space using CIDR. Look down at the bottom at the same time. This is 95, and by this stage, commercial internets were actually starting to boom. And you can start to see as well that this actually fueled a relatively large growth in routing in terms of distinct routing policies. So now the relative rate of consumption of autonomous system numbers is quite high, whereas CIDR has actually managed to damp down the relative rate of consumption of IP addresses. So now you see a relatively hefty amount of consumption of AS numbers, and we're now up to around 9,000, whereas in the IP address space it's a lot lower. By 1997 we're also able to get some routing information. The dark green is actually what is seen in the domain routing table, the interdomain routing table, whereas the light green are allocated networks that are actually not visible, private, hoarded, whatever. You notice in the old Class A space, the space that's managed actually by IANA, there's a lot of light green. A lot of these networks that were given out are not being routed on the internet. Even in the old Class B space, you see around 30% of those networks are actually not being routed. It's only actually the more recently allocated addresses, which were done by the RIR system, that you actually tend to see a pretty tight correlation between assignment and routing, that most of what is actually being assigned is routed. Those fluctuations, by the way, are actually anomalies in the data collection system. Look at the autonomous system numbers there for a second. You notice they sort of seem to die off, that the half-life of an AS number is around 3 years or so, and after 3 years you just throw it away and get a new one. By 2002, 2 odd years ago now, what we're seeing is a very hefty pressure on routing and consumption of AS numbers, whereas the IP address growth is actually really quite damped. That CIDR has actually managed to put a constraint on the quite rapid consumption of IP addresses, whereas the consumption of AS numbers, as you see on the meter there, it's reading between 4 and 5. In other words, the AS consumption is really quite high. And we're still killing off old AS numbers. We only seem to use AS numbers for a small period of time and then stop. So that, I hope, has given you some insights into how we got to where we are. And if there are any questions on this, please don't hesitate to send some email to the authors. That's their email address there. This movie was generated by George Michelson and myself, Jeff Houston, from APNIC, using data from the Regional Internet Registry stats files and also using data picked up from the Route Views project of old BGP snapshots, put together using public domain software. Thank you.